So this video will show you how to take apart and rebuild the wheel bearings on a bike.
So both the front and the back wheels on your bike have a set of bearings in them, and basically that's what allows your wheel to rotate so freely, without having any friction that makes it hard for it to move. It's got little ball bearings which are right inside here, another set inside here, and that's what allows it to roll freely and rotate nice and smoothly. The front wheel and the back wheel, it's both exactly the same system. The only difference is if you're doing this job on the back wheel, the first step you have to do is remove the cassette. But I'm going to demonstrate how to do it on the front wheel.
So the first step you want to do here obviously is to remove the wheel that you're working on from the bike. So you start doing that by disconnecting the brakes. And if you happen to have a wheel with a quick release, all you have to do is loosen the quick release off and then just pull the wheel right off. But if this bike doesn't have quick release, so I'm going to use a 15mm wrench to loosen off these nuts on the end. You don't take the nuts all the way off, just loosen them off a little bit and the wheel should come right out like this. Just like that. So before I do any work on this hub here, I'm going to explain how the hub itself works. So for us to understand how the inner parts of a hub work, what I've done here is I've drawn a picture on the board which is basically a cross-sectional view of how one of these hubs works. So basically imagine I've taken a saw and I'm going to section it right down the middle here, and the two parts break apart, and then you're looking at it from this view here. So first the shaft which runs through the middle, this thing with the slashed lines across it, that's your axle. That's what your whole wheel rotates around, and it's also what connects your wheel to the bike. So there's a nut that goes here, a nut that goes here, and that's what holds your axle to your frame, and that's what just puts your wheel on your bike basically. When I took those nuts off at the beginning of this video, that's what I was doing. So this middle part here, this big brown line which comes all the way around, that's one big piece of metal. That's called the hub. So here's a hub right here. So this metal part here, this part here, that's all one solid piece. That's called your hub, and that's what basically connects your axle to your wheel itself. So these orange parts, which are here, 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 and here, are the spokes, which are connecting your axle to your rim. So these holes here on the outside, that's where your spokes connect to your hub. So these green pieces here are the ball bearings. You've actually got a full set of them. You only see two of them in this picture. But if it was three-dimensional, they would come out from the board and form an arc, and they'd make another arc into the board. There's a whole bunch of ball bearings, which are all side by side, forming a circle inside of there. But what they do is they're what rolls, they are what actually reduce the friction of two surfaces. Instead of rubbing against each other, they have this small ball inside there which is constantly rolling around and around and around, and that's what makes your wheel able to rotate with very little amount of friction. So these ball bearings, they roll against two opposite surfaces. This big cup here, this big circular shape, that's what's called the cup, and that's what the ball bearing rotates against on the inside of the hub. So all the hubs on the inside of them, they have this round surface where the ball bearing itself rotates around. And the other surface which it rotates around is the orange parts here, which are called the cones. So the cones, basically you tighten the cones in so that you're pressing the ball bearing against both surfaces, and the cone stays stationary with the bike, and the wheel itself rotates and allows the ball bearing to rotate and make the friction reduced as a result. So the cones here are actually what really dictates how tight your bearings are going to be. You want these cones to be close enough together that you're not going to be feeling the wheel itself wobbling back and forth, or having like little gaps on either side of the ball bearing. But you also don't want them so tight that they're basically wedging the two surfaces so close together that it can't rotate very nicely. So you got to find the happy medium in between, so that you can't feel the wheel rocking, and also so that it rotates smoothly enough. So the last part to explain are these blue parts here, which are called the lock nuts. So basically this wheel's rotating round and around and around, and there is a little bit of friction between the ball bearing and the cone. So that if these lock nuts weren't here, over time, then the cones would just get unthreaded, and you'd have that problem I was talking about where the wheel would be really loose. So what you do is you have this lock nut and the cone, which are side by side,
and you rotate them in different directions, and you lock the two surfaces together so that it's not going to move at all, and it should, you know, stay the way you set it for a very long time. So if I want to take this hub here apart, all I got to do is remove the hardware from one of the sides, so either this side here or this side here, and then the axle itself should just pull right out of there. So I can do this top side here. First, you can just take that nut off that was being used for holding the wheel to the frame. Just a very basic looking nut is used for that. So now that I've got the nut off, you can see the two parts that I was talking about before. The lock nut is this piece up top here, and underneath that you've got the cone. So as I rotate the axle here, you can see that the cone has these little flat spots on it. What we're going to do next is we're going to remove the lock nut from the axle. So to do that, these two surfaces are locked together. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a wrench on the cone. We're going to keep the cone stationary, and then we're going to rotate the lock nut off. However, the tricky thing about cones is they make them so thin and narrow that if I try to put a regular wrench in there, it's not going to fit because this lock nut's in my way. So I need a very thin wrench, and they make these very special wrenches called cone wrenches, which are very thin cross section, and they just go on like that, and it fits in there perfectly. And then all I have to do is put my other wrench onto the lock nut there, and then we just rotate them in opposite directions. So these two surfaces in there have been locked together against each other. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to rotate them in opposite directions. So to loosen it, you're going to keep the cone wrench that's attached to the cone stationary in one spot, and then you're going to take the other wrench, which is attached to the lock nut, and you're going to rotate it counterclockwise to remove it from the axle. So I'm just going to hold this one stationary here, and then I'm going to rotate the other one like this. And sometimes it's pretty tight, but this one was actually pretty loose. Once you get it started, you should be able to finish it with your fingers. So there we've got it removed there. It's just pretty much just a basic nut, very similar to the one that we use for holding the axle to the wheel. So now something I want to point out about cone wrenches is that they come in lots of different sizes. You can see from the collection here, they range from as small as 13 millimeters all the way up to 19 millimeters. And it is very important that you get the right size when you're using it, because it's a very thin wrench. And the thing is, if you're putting it on it's the wrong size, there's a lot of play in there, and it has a tendency of bending and warping the ends of the wrench. So if you got one that looks like this, it's not going to be able to grip onto your cone very well, and you're going to have a lot of difficulty getting it tight when you're tightening it back up again. So make sure you use the right size cone wrench for the cone that you're working on. So now the hard part's done. All you've got on here is the cone, and now the cone is unlocked, so it's very easy to remove. So to do that, all you've got to do is just hold on to one side, the other side of the axle down here, and then you can just rotate it off. So as you're doing this, you need to make sure that you press firmly on the bottom down here, because what you're doing is you're letting the ball bearings be free, and if you don't do that, a whole bunch of ball bearings are going to fall out through the bottom. So just rotating this cone all the way off. So that's what the cone looks like when it comes off. It's got that little sort of a lip surface, the shiny part you can see, that's where the ball bearings rub up against it, and the other side of the ball bearings rubbing up against the inside of the wheel. You can see them inside there. The grease on this bearing has actually been done quite recently, so yours probably won't look that clean unless it's been very recent. So I just pushed the axle through to the other side. Now you can see the other set of ball bearings. They're pretty much exactly the same. You've got exactly the same hardware on this side. Of course, your cone, your lock nut, and then your wheel bolt there. You don't need to take any of that stuff apart because to get into the inside you only have to take the one side apart anyways. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take everything apart and clean it up, rub a rag around it and just make sure everything's still in good shape, and I'll show you that when I'm finished. So I just spent some time cleaning up everything. All I used was just a rag and just wiped all the old grease off, put a little bit of oil on to clean off the little black spots. But as you're doing this, you want to inspect everything and make sure it's in pretty good shape. So for the most part, both sets of ball bearings are in pretty good shape. It's always a good idea to keep the two sets of ball bearings separate when you're working on them because they do wear at different rates, so it's a good idea to keep them as a set so they're always working together in the wheel. When I was looking at my cones, however, I saw that there's quite a bit of pitting on both of them. You can see right there on the shiny spot, there's a lot of rough little edges in there. And you really don't want that. That just happens over time from all the friction that's in there. that's going to cause a lot of friction. It's making your wheel not rotate very nicely. You know, it's not too significant as it is right now, but since I do have a spare set of them, I might as well just replace it with this, so it'll work better in the future. My cone on the other side is also having the same issue too. You can see right, and that part's on the top there. It's quite rough as well. So I'm going to replace both cones before I reassemble. And the other thing you want to inspect as well is inside the cups here. You want to make sure you get them nice and clean, and just check inside there, make sure there's no pitting, no rough spots, anything like that. You know, that's just going to, again, slow you down more. It's going to cause more friction. So just make sure there isn't any of those. So the first step for reassembly is to fill both cups up with lots of grease. So you want to make sure you get that cup nice and filled up with grease. You definitely don't want to have too little amount in there, because it's going to be dry, and then it's going to cause more friction, and it's probably going to cause more pitting. So make sure you get lots in there. Don't worry about having a little bit extra that comes over the edges. You can easily wipe that off when you're finished. So now to reassemble, you want to put your ball bearings back in their homes into the cup there. So just get them one by one and place them so they go all the way around in a circle. And the grease should help them stay there. So there they are all inside there nicely. This hub actually uses 10 ball bearings, but they can definitely vary from hub to hub. It looks like there's a bit of gap in between each ball bearing, and that's what you want. I'm pretty sure 10 is the correct number in here. You definitely don't want them so that they're so tight in there that they're always touching each other, because each ball bearing is rotating on its own, so you don't want them to be rubbing against one another too much. So now the axle goes inside there, so you just drop it down, and your cone is going to be touching up against those ball bearings, and you should be able to feel that it's nice and smooth with that new grease in there. Now we're going to flip the wheel over so we can put the hardware back on the other side, but we got to make sure we press down on here so that the ball bearings don't come flying out. So now we're on the other end of the axle here, so we're going to put our ball bearings in this end too, so they just go in exactly the same way. Just one at a time all the way around. There should be 10 on this side as well for this wheel. So now you can see I've got those positioned in there nicely. So now the first piece of hardware that goes on there is your cone. And you might just threads on. You can probably do it with your fingers most of the time. You might need to grip onto the other end of the axle to make it so it's able to spin. So just spin that all the way on. So for now, don't worry about getting that too tight in there, because after we put the lock nut on, we're going to lock it in the right position. So anything you do right now, it's not going to stay where it's supposed to be. So just put your lock nut on next. So the next step here is the tricky part. This is where you're going to want to lock your lock nut to your cone. But the tricky part is getting it in the exact right spot, so there's not so much friction from being wedged together, but also so that it's not really loose, so that it's wobbling all over the place. So right now I've got it in a position where it's really loose, so you can see this axle just still moves all over the place, right? So you definitely don't want it to be that loose, so I'll just tighten it on a little bit and show the other case. So right now I've got it set so that it's really tight, so you can see as I try and turn it, it really doesn't want to move much at all. So you definitely don't want it to be that tight, because it's going to make a lot of friction, and it's going to slow you down quite a bit. So you got to find the medium in between the two. So this step requires quite a bit of trial and error. You'll find as soon as you start tightening the two surfaces together that the cone itself will shift a little bit, and the place where you put it when you started is not going to be where it is when it's finished. And really, you really have to inspect at the end is that it's in the right spot after it's tightened together. So I'm just going to demonstrate how to lock these two surfaces back together again. You're going to put your cone wrench onto your cone like that, and then you're going to put your other wrench onto your lock nut there, and then you're going to rotate your lock nut clockwise, so you're tightening the two surfaces together just like this. And you're going to want to pull them really hard together, so it's going to stay there in place for a long time. So now I've got these two surfaces locked back together again, and I can already feel, as I said, it's trial and error, I can already feel that it's pretty tight in those bearings. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to loosen the lock nut back off, and I'm going to try again with the cone in a different position, a little bit looser to begin with before I tighten it together. So I'm going to give that a try and see if I can get it right this time. So I'm satisfied here with my second try. There's definitely no play in it at all. You would be able to feel it rocking back and forth if there was. And it's also nice and smooth too. It rotates
very smoothly, very freely. So this job is pretty much done. All I got to do is put it back on my bike.
So I got the wheel back on the bike there, and I just, as I mentioned, it only took me 2 tries to get the cones in the right spots where I wanted them. But I really just got lucky this time. Sometimes it takes me up to 10 tries to get it exactly where I want it. And it's pretty important to make sure you get it in the right spot. Having your bearings too tight or too loose can really affect your riding. Well, if it's too tight, it's definitely going to slow you down, and if it's too loose, it's probably going to be pretty unsafe with your wheel being loose. And it's also going to wear things out pretty fast if the ball bearings are able to roll all over the place in there. There's going to be quite a bit of sections of the cup and the cone that are going to be worn out a lot faster from them not being in the right spots. On that same note, you do want to make sure when you're finished working on the wheel that you have those lock nuts against your cones really tight, because it is going to loosen itself off if you don't. And you're gonna, you don't want to have to come back in a week and redo everything again because your wheel is all of a sudden loose again.
So that concludes my tutorial on how to take apart and reassemble the wheel bearing on a bicycle. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. I'm pretty fast at responding to comments, so I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And thanks for watching.